So, as the debates and discussions continue around Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and this new peace proposal, there seems to be something bigger going on. Indeed, for me, something that never really quite added up about the American approach. The timeline is strange, the demands extreme, and of course the contradictions were obvious. But just as Ukraine started to push back, the Trump team suddenly softened their own deadline, and Trump himself hinted that this wasn't the final draft after all. Meanwhile, Russia's making its own mind games and Europe its own counter-proposals. So in this video, I wanted to take a deeper look at what actually might be happening behind the scenes. Not about the media hysteria and coverage, but the growing evidence that this may have been badly written as an initial proposal, but this is actually perhaps part of a broader, deliberate negotiating gambit designed to placate the Ukrainians, kickstart the Europeans, and keep Moscow guessing. Stick around for this video, because there's always so much more to diplomacy than we can ever imagine on the surface, and coming from someone who's done it personally, I can tell you there's a lot you might have missed. Let's get into it.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we focus on the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft. But for the time being, potential likely focus on the developments around the Ukraine peace proposal and its processes given its magnitude. Now, I will also add a caveat that this isn't a news channel. I'm not going to be able to cover every single development in real time because, well, they could not just so much be out of date in a day, but even in an hour. More what I aim to do here is take a particular angle or a particular aspect and dissect it further, what I think is not being covered as much, and actually ultimately lends to a more important background story to what's going on, such as in this video about a particular strategy I think the US government is taking here, and perhaps the Americans are beginning to encourage the Europeans to think about as well. But more on that later in the video, so I do encourage you to stick around. And also because I want to know from you guys in the comments, what do you think? Is this just a badly drafted initial proposal? Was it actually drafted more in Moscow than in Washington? Or is it a calculated tactic by the Trump administration? And I know what you're thinking. Tactical? Calculated? Trump? Tongue-in-cheek aside, though, this is because Ukraine has always feared that Russia would be negotiated directly with by America, or Trump administration America, and that this ready-made plan will then just be presented to Ukraine and they have to accept without any debate over the matter. It should go without saying that Trump sees the world in a very different way to, say, Biden, or one that is much more closely aligned to Putin, that of might is right, that simply that bigger nation-states can dictate terms to smaller ones. And in this is reflected in the original proposal around three big themes: freezing the front lines in ways that heavily favour Moscow, handing Russia the de facto control of these additional parts of the Donbass that Ukraine still has plenty of presence and control over itself, and also thirdly, dramatically limiting the size of Ukraine's armed forces. All of these sound like the maximalist original Russian demands, and of course, many people have still retained that belief. However, to some, including myself, this may actually be a form of what's known as anchoring, an extreme opening bid designed to shift the entire negotiation towards actually America, or perhaps even Trump's personal preferences. You see, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said that Russia still hasn't been given this updated Geneva version. That effectively makes Moscow nervous. Putin has called the original draft a basis for a settlement because it favours Russia's terms. But now Moscow is already suspecting that revisions are being incredibly less generous. Some major Russian tabloids writing that Europe and Ukraine are correcting Trump's plans until it becomes more and more acceptable for them, but less for us. But Trump, if he really wanted the original peace plan to be the version, he wouldn't be allowing them to do so. Why would the US create a plan Russia loved and then allow revisements in ways that Russia fears? This is exactly what you'd expect if the original was an anchor, designed to drag negotiations to Moscow's position before moderating it. We can go back further in the year to see that Trump has tried this in other theatres, let alone just in Russia-Ukraine. He's proposed outrageous original, maybe not him personally, but people around him have proposed outrageous ideas with the idea of trying to then bring it further to the middle ground. Zelensky says Putin wants legal recognition of what he has stolen, and the draft suggests Ukraine hand over its territory it still controls, placing thousands died defending. So why would the US propose something politically impossible for Kyiv? Anchoring, again, some people argue, fits. It presents this unthinkable plan, lets Ukraine reject it, and then present a more moderated version Kyiv feels more relieved or willing to accept. It is classic Trump deal-making. shock, destabilize, then pull the other side towards your preferred middle ground. It's also something you can argue you see in the Overton window, a political concept which argues if you want to bring people more round to a radical idea of the political spectrum, you first start with a more reasonable one. Take gay marriage 20, 30 years ago would have been considered absolutely out of the question. And so some countries offered more moderate versions, such as civil unions in the UK, or other means by which to then gradually lead to the acceptance and legalization of full gay marriage. It's the same sort of thing. The acclimatization that we get used to it, and therefore it's becoming more acceptable. Now, Europe has struggled to project any coherent voice up until now. Leaders are in different parts of the world discussing this and trying to see how Europe can take point on it. Macron, France's president, fears shrinking Ukraine's military, invites renewed Russian attack, and Germany's chancellor has warned Trump of severe consequences if Ukraine were to collapse on the military front. Even Finland's President Stubb, who has been very good at placating Donald Trump, has said that Europe will need to take a separate track if needed. Diplomatic for stop anchoring so far from reality. But Washington is still the driving process behind this, and right at the time of recording, of course, we see the coalition of the willing likely later to meet this week, and so we could see some more amendments here. The point being that the anchoring is not all just in DC, but more in Brussels, London, etc. Now, Trump has used anchoring for decades. Start extreme, shock the other side, create that urgency, and let them think that they can win some form of concessions. This 28-point plan fits perfectly. Maximalist demands, impossible deadlines, contradictory clauses. Then Trump claims it's not final and he reopens the talk. Some senior former intelligence staff have said that the plan looked like Moscow talking points and would turn Ukraine into a tethered goat. But I've also suggested it, of course, isn't the final. No real settlement would start with Ukraine unable to defend itself and would come out of this such an unrealistic basis that it's not only about trying to shock Ukraine, but also unnerve Russia and make Putin think, yes, this can be a basis, but then suddenly the goalposts moved a little bit and Putin's like, we have to adjust. One contradiction, the plan offers Western-backed guarantees but bans NATO membership. Germany now says the ban may have been removed. Moscow hates any guarantee at all, and therefore this is likely to remain the primary complication. Through the anchoring lens, though, it's another extreme clause included to be a bargaining chip, to be bargained away. And so some people believe that there are potentially three paths here. I'm not here to prescribe any particular one that is most effective, more just offer you these thoughts and give you a deeper understanding or consideration of what's actually going on behind just the headlines of the mainstream media. Scenario 1. Ukraine rejects the plan. The anchor fails, Trump cuts that support. That is something that people who are very staunchly pro-Ukraine believe is still most likely. Scenario 2. Ukraine accepts it as a basis. Right now, this is Ukraine's position. It signals willingness, not acceptance, forcing us to reveal how much was bluff, and continuing the negotiations, which after a couple of days in Geneva seem to be wrapping up. But there is discussion around this ongoing for the next few weeks to see if this can be a blueprint. Scenario 3, the plan collapses. Now, this is, of course, unfortunately, one of the more likely ones. Russia wants more, Putin wants more, and Ukraine is not going to accept those limits. So this guarantees continued attritional conflict, and the anchor, again, doesn't work. The thing about Trump is he seems to think that working in business means that he's got the skill to do it in diplomacy, which is not the case. And especially when you're talking about a conflict which involves two countries and intrinsically and historically linked, as Russia and Ukraine being tried to be resolved and dealt with a country hundreds, thousands of miles away, which is a fraction of the age of both of them, means that it's not likely that this anchoring can work. But it's interesting to postulate whether this is actually what Trump is trying to do. You see, Ukraine needs the war to end, but not at any price. Sustainably, the country has lost a quarter of its population through migration, and the economy is barely functioning, incredibly reliant on Western support. Russia's is struggling as well, but as it stands, Ukraine is on the precipice more than Moscow's is. Kiev's strategy, therefore, is accept the plan as a basis, try to drag out the talks, expose the contradictions, and encourage Trump to revise his own anchor, show that Putin, not Ukraine, is blocking the peace. And that's, I feel, illustrated because of how Putin continues to strike innocent civilians across the country. But this is how you dismantle this hostile, you could say, opening bid. And in therefore the coming days, we learn whether this is a real potential peace plan with much more life and longevity in it than we've seen in previous attempts, or just a pressure tactic disguised as one. Zelensky has warned in these addresses that he's given that it is the most difficult decision for the country in much of its history, if not at all. When you cut through the oddities of this plan, including the clause about forbidding Ukraine from striking Moscow or St. Petersburg, but not the rest of Russia, while also putting no limit on Russian attacks, the core trade becomes brutally clear for many. Russia is rewarded for halting its invasion. It keeps the occupied territory and even gains more. It is welcome back to the G8 and global markets. Sanctions are effectively lifted and it gains new avenues to make money. Western businesses are able to re-enter. All Ukraine gets is a ceasefire and an American guarantee that Russia won't attack again, which sounds great, but historically, as we know, in the Minsk Accords and the Budapest Memorandum, were not reliable, and therefore one completely understands the Ukrainian unwillingness or skepticism over it, even if they are showing a willingness in the negotiations. Zelensky would surrender major cities, extensive defensive lines, and fortified positions that it has spent 3 years not just building but also protecting. And the Ukrainian army would be capped at a limit which, well, Russia doesn't have, and therefore its vulnerability only increases. And of course, all of this bleeds into Europe, something that I cover as much in the context of the war. And if Europe can't consider itself protected either, then what does that mean for the relevancy of NATO, or what remains, if anything, of the transatlantic relationship? Worse, the plan rewards Putin's aggression and incentivizes him to pick up other potential areas across the continent where he can undermine Western democracy and interests, and that Europe is not ready to do something, especially in the greater power political shifts that we're seeing occur across the globe. So therefore, what should Ukraine do? Zelensky can't afford to fight Trump and Putin at the same time, so his best option is to engage as he's doing. Engage the plan politely, thanking Trump for his efforts and making sure that he shows gratitude, as Vance always said he didn't for some reason, but negotiate incrementally for the improvements. The aim not to just accept the deal, but to, by that time, draw out these contradictions and emphasize that it's Putin who is the biggest obstacle. All Russia has to do, as always, is just leave Ukraine, and we could have a genuine conversation about the relationship of these two, security concerns of Russia, the expansion or role of NATO in Europe, the role of Ukraine and where it sits. But also Europe must be having to urgently step up. Enough of the outrage or the shock about what has happened between the United States and Russia, or the disregard and dissatisfaction of being left out. It's, at the end of the day, the continent that is most at risk, and yet seems to be the most complacent and sitting on its hands when it comes to actually wanting to get up and show action instead of just rhetoric. Perhaps it can approach this its own way, taking a novel approach through the use of anchoring or other forms of bargaining, bandwagoning, and other concepts in international relations, which I try to cover on the channel as well if you're interested in these things, but don't necessarily have a background in them or know how they work. Diplomacy is anything but what you actually see in the headlines, but with that in mind, that's it from me tonight. Thanks for watching, and let me know again in the comments what you think. And if you enjoyed the video, then do give it a like, a subscribe, and consider joining the community, be that as a member, or give me a one-time coffee as I try to make my best to make these videos interesting, but dynamic and timely, as always, including guests that I bring on. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care.